All right. Good noon, everybody, and welcome back to God Was Here, our study of the life of Christ as recorded in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Last time we were still in these teachings of Christ, and we dealt with two pretty important ones. One was when he was dealing with the rich young man, and then we also dealt with the second time he talked about divorce. We already saw that back in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 19, and the chapters that harmonize with that. They really just expound on some of those ideas. We're going to go into another parable for this one. I expect it might be a shorter one. We're only going to be dealing with one parable, and it's only found in Luke's account. So let's go ahead and turn over to the book of Luke, chapter 16. And beginning in verse 1, the Bible reads, "He also said to the disciples, 'There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So summoning his master's debtors, one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings.'" This is a decently controversial part of Scripture that has had many interpretations. If you're familiar with several parables of Christ, chances are you're probably less familiar with this one. We don't like to talk about this one that much, just because it's hard. I'm going to spoil what I've got to say about it for you, in that I don't necessarily have an exact answer of what everything is meant here, although I think I have a couple of ideas about it. But let's quickly recap what just happened. In the parable, you had a master who has a manager. I apologize for the train. You have a master who has a manager or a steward, depending on your version. And he finds out that he's been dishonest. Already we see dishonesty from the manager. And he informs the manager of his intention to fire him. I guess the old corporate, take your things in a box and leave and be escorted by security would have been beneficial for this particular master. Because when the manager finds out that he is going to be fired, he says to himself, I don't want to beg, and I don't want to, the Bible says I can't dig. I don't know if that means that he was an old manager, and so he just wasn't physically capable of manual labor. Maybe it just means that he didn't really want to do that. But he's trying to figure out what he's going to do, how he's going to survive, and he comes up with this idea. He goes to the people who have debts to the master. And he asks, how much do you owe my master? And one says 100 measures of oil, for modern purposes, say $1,000, right? He says, write down 50. If we're keeping with our modern change to it, then, write down $500. In other words, I am saving you a whole lot of money here. And then he goes to the next person who owes the master something, in this case 100 measures of grain, and says write down 80. instead. So do you see what he's doing? He's committing fraud is what he's doing. I'm not really sure if this is somehow legal under the Jewish system or not. Somebody with more insight into that background, if you'd like to, you can certainly let me know about that. But we would consider it fraud. And essentially, he's doing this. Now, he doesn't profit from it, right? The manager is not getting anything from this, except now all of these people who used to owe his master, now they kind of owe him a favor. The Lord is not particularly clear as to what the manager's plan here was. If he's just going to start couch surfing between all these people who just helped him out, or maybe he's thinking this will help me get another cushy job for one of these people. I don't know. But he is looking to get social benefit from it. And then, and this is the part that we start to find troubling on it. The Lord commends him. Notice I say commend, not condemn, commend, the good one. He does that. He commends him for his shrewdness. A lot of people don't really understand the meaning of the word shrewd. It doesn't actually necessarily have a negative connotation to it. It just means intelligent, clever. Now, that being said, it's usually used in a negative way, right? We might think of a fox, right? The fox would be something we would consider shrewd. It's clever, but it's sometimes used for a negative way. So, we have the master commending this. And you might be wondering, if you've been paying attention to this, you might be wondering, well, wait a minute. Jesus, in no uncertain terms, has been calling the actions of the manager unjust. And then at the end of the parable, and that is the end of the parable, he says he is commended for these actions. Weird, right? What are we to make of this? Is this inconsistency on the part of the Lord? Well, we can certainly throw that out, because again, it's Jesus himself. We're not the ones making the judgment. I mean, we can, but we're not the ones making the judgment on the manager that his actions are unjust. Jesus has already made that judgment for us. So he's not being inconsistent. So don't make some mistake, or don't make the mistake of thinking that he doesn't, that Jesus is being inconsistent, because he is. But often it's the case that there are certain parts of parables we are supposed to pick up and others we are not. We're not supposed to emulate every single part of a parable. And this is a big place where we see that. What does it mean? Well, Kaufman suggested as much as this. He suggested the following meanings within the parable. Number one, that the Lord who, is not always there and requires the manager, that one is the Lord, that's God, right? That the dishonest managers in this case, or the dishonest manager, are the Jewish elite, or the Pharisees. Now, where do we come up with that conclusion? Well, for that, we really need to see into the context of this. If you're in Luke 16, you just look back to Luke chapter 15, and you can see the context, because this starts in 15 verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." If that sounds familiar to you, it's because we dealt with that just a couple of weeks ago. This is the lead up to the parable of the lost sheep, of the lost coin, and most importantly, the parable of the prodigal son. It's still in the same context, apparently, that Luke is saying Jesus gives this parable. So it makes sense. He was condemning the Pharisees from before. Remember also that at the end of the parable of the prodigal son, there is more to it, because the point of the parable of the lost sheep and of the lost coin is how diligently the Lord searches out for those who are lost. The point of the first half of the parable of the prodigal son is the exact same thing, just put in a way that touches us so thoroughly. But the second half of it turns to the Pharisees, who are the older brother in this case. It turns to those who are more focused on their own righteousness than the reconciliation of those who were once unrighteous to God. You might remember that when we were looking through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had this habit of going from topic to topic, and it wasn't in a disjointed way. He would use certain concepts as segues. For example, he was not talking about the idea of forgiving those who, or being forgiving, God forgiving those who forgive, before he goes into the model prayer. He was talking about making sure that you don't do righteous things such as giving to the poor, fasting, or praying for the praise of others. And then he gives the model prayer as that last example prayer. When you pray, don't keep praying in long repetitions just so that you think you'll be heard by God or so that you'll be seen by others. His point was, pray simply for what you need. But what was included in that prayer was, forgive us of our debts as we forget our debtors. And he used that to then transition into the idea for if we forgive not others, or for if you forgive not others their trespasses, neither will your trespasses be forgiven. So do you see what he's done there? He's used that as a segue. I think he's doing the same thing here. We were talking about God diligently searching for those who are lost. And then in that last one, we got to talk about those who are self-righteous. Now, piggybacking off of that, still talking about the Pharisees here, we go to the parable of the dishonest manager. Now, how had they acted in the same way as a dishonest manager? Well, remember, at the beginning of this, the dishonest manager had already acted dishonestly, and we know that the Jewish elite from this time were not really particularly concerned, and it doesn't really matter who you're talking about, Pharisees, Sadducees, or whomever. It doesn't really matter. They were acting dishonestly with the law. To oversimplify it, the Pharisees had added to the law, the Sadducees had taken from the law, in both cases, dishonest managing. So now, God says, this is going to be taken from you. Now, how did he do that in real life? He did that with the birth of Jesus. Jesus was going to usher in a new kingdom in which their power would be gone. Jesus seems to be talking then about the Pharisees and how they resist those attempts through social means. Of course, spoiler alert, these attempts would culminate in the crucifixion. Jesus is simply mentioning that they are acting with shrewdness. It's very, I think, important here that we use the word shrewdness. I don't know if there's a distinction in the Greek. I neglected to see. But that we use the word shrewdness rather than wisdom. Whether there is a distinction in the Greek, when we look at it in context, the meaning is clear. Because generally speaking, we think of wisdom as a positive thing, just about akin to morality as well. Shrewdness is definitely the correct word here. Jesus is not saying that they're good people. He's just mentioning they're acting in a way that has a twisted wisdom to it. You know, you can admit that somebody is doing something well, even if they're an evil person, right? Will we be tying ourselves in knots over trying to figure out what this means if he had talked about somebody who was a very strong person and mentioned that another might commend him for his strength? Of course not. Neither is it a problem, really, if he commends them for acting shrewdly. He's essentially talking about them using their intelligence to turn the world against him, which is, of course, how this would culminate, and you can see that happening from the very beginning of this context. Now, he's going to say some other things as well that might cast doubt on that interpretation. However, I would like to point something out. There have been a few times, as we've been going through this study, that we find out, I think Luke especially has this tendency of putting a similar teaching of Christ, but it's not necessarily exactly when he said it. This isn't a problem. Remember, the Gospels are not meant to be taken as always chronological. But often, and I do think, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Luke has the tendency to do this more than anybody else. He will talk about two similar things that Jesus taught when they weren't necessarily actually taught at the same time, even if they don't have the same message. And let's look at what happens at the end here, because the end is where you might get confused. Remember, it said in verse 9, "And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings." Now, this is a difficult thing. By means of unrighteous wealth. First of all, we should point out that the Greek here is mammon, which unrighteous wealth is good interpretation, but it doesn't necessarily mean wealth gotten from unrighteous means. It's well, actually, hold on. I think I just misspoke. It's not saying the wealth itself is unrighteous. Rather, it means wealth from unrighteous means. Jesus says, make friends from unrighteous means. Here's what he is saying. This is, back to the parable. That is what that manager was doing, right? He was using unrighteous wealth to make friends. He says to his disciples, essentially, the Pharisees are acting shrewdly. You act shrewdly as well. He's not telling them to be unrighteous, nor to act exactly in this way, but they are using intelligence, and we should too. Too many people act as if Christianity is something that is totally absent from the head. I am so tired of people defining faith as belief without evidence. That's the exact opposite of what faith is. Faith is belief because of evidence, not in spite of a lack of. And we act as though Christianity should almost be stupid. It shouldn't. Christianity should be smart. In another place, Jesus said to be wise as serpents, as harmless as doves. I think this is a similar concept here. Have wisdom. Be shrewd. Be smart about how you go about things. That's all he's saying. The parable is a condemnation of the Pharisees. This is not an explanation of the parable, but as a result of the explanation of the parable, he says, therefore, since they are being wise, you should be wise as well. Now, I mentioned that Luke sometimes has a tendency to tack on something that Jesus said in a different place because it has a similar theme. I think the following verses is an effect of that. I don't think Jesus said it directly after this. That's my explanation for it anyway. Let's read what he says. Verse 10. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, again mammon, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will go and give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money, or again, mammon. So here I think it comes in a different place because and if somebody has an explanation for this, please feel free to comment because I'm very curious about this parable. But to me, this seems to be just totally disjointed, not related to the parable at all, but rather a different teaching of Jesus on a different topic, but also so happens to have the word mammon showing up a lot. And this is what he says, by the way, because of course it is extremely important, talking about our priorities. And also it goes a lot with one of the things we dealt with last week, being the rich young ruler. You cannot serve God and mammon. And in fact, I believe Jesus said that at the same time, which would indicate that Luke is just dropping that particular part of it. And in fact, this might be Luke's recording of Jesus' interaction with the rich young ruler, just leaving that part out and the teaching coming afterwards. But he says something very important, and it helps us understand priorities. This really helps us interpret the rich young ruler. Again, some will look at that and say, well, there you go, it's sinful for a Christian to be rich. And we've pretty much dispelled that last week. Go back there if you want to see what we have to say about that. But as far as this goes, this helps us understand. This expounds the understanding. It's not about what you actually have. It's about where your priorities are. Going back to the Sermon on the Mount, it's about where you have laid up your treasures. You cannot serve God and mammon. Make God your number one priority. And if God is your number one priority, there is going to be a limitation of your wealth. You will naturally act charitably if God is your number one priority. You cannot serve God and mammon. All right. Well, I think that will just about wrap up my thoughts on the parable of the dishonest manager. Like I said, this is an interesting one, and it's one where I'm not quite as confident on some of the interpretations. It's a difficult teaching of Christ, and so if you have some insight into that, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Until then, I hope you have a wonderful week. Love you all, and goodbye.